Well, welcome everyone, and we want to begin by first saying to everybody, this is, of course, one of my first times having this friend of mine, special guest, Robert Spencer. You're in for a great show tonight, and I'm just going to bring him on right now. Robert, welcome, and thank you for giving up your Wednesday evening to share with us tonight, sir.
Good to talk to you, Tony. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, folks, before we begin, I just want to give you a summary or a bio summary of Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer is the director of Jihad Watch and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He is the author of 23 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, and The Truth About Muhammad, and the best-selling The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. His latest book, which will be the subject of our discussion tonight, is Did Muhammad Exist? An Inquiry into Islam's Obscure Origins, which you can see on the screen, revised and expanded edition. So I was just sharing with Robert beforehand that I have the first edition, but you do really want to get that revised and expanded edition. A lot of good information in there.
Yeah, the old one's been abrogated, Tony. It's gone.
So the old one's a Meccan version. So
That's right.
Right. This is the Medina version.
This is the Medina Did Muhammad Exist?
Okay, there you go. Okay. So Robert Spencer has also led seminars on Islam and Jihad for the FBI, the United States Central Command, United States Army Command, and General Staff College, the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, JTTF, the Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council, and the U.S. intelligence community. He has discussed jihad, Islam, and terrorism at a workshop sponsored by the U.S. State Department and the German Foreign Ministry. He is a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy. And so it's a great delight to have you on, Robert. We've known each other for a couple of years, and I still remember our first encounter when you were visiting Toronto. And I walked in, and you looked at me, and it was one of those looks, either as he's a Muslim, he's an underground terrorist, or he's my brother-in-law.
Yes. Yeah, you're a ringer. You look just like my brother-in-law. So,
well, maybe if your brother-in-law is watching, maybe we're separated at birth.
Yes.
But it's so good to have you on, Robert, and I'm so thankful for the work that you do. I've been following you on Jihad Watch, of course. You could, the viewers, if you'd like, you could receive email notifications. Jihad Watch posts. It's daily, right, Robert?
Yes, that's right.
It's
every last day. Yes.
Yeah. And so if you want to be on top of the game and know what's going on around the world in terms of jihad that is taking place around the world, and it's almost every single day. And of course, most of our viewers also know, Robert, about our dear friend Hatun Tash, who was recently assailed, attacked by a Muslim in Speaker's Corner at Hyde Park in London. But tonight we want to really talk about the subject of Muhammad, the figure of Muhammad. And as you know, Robert, it's very common in academia to question everything. And of course, Jesus of Nazareth his existence has been questioned, and yet he's come out in glowing colors. Most historians would admit that we know more about Jesus of Nazareth in terms of textual evidence availability, the New Testament documents, and of course, the Greco-Roman writings, the Jewish Talmud. But in terms of Muhammad, it's interesting that we really don't have a lot of information in terms of his biographical sketch or that he even existed. Can you fill us in on that, Robert?
Yeah, actually, it's a very good analogy, the origins of Christianity, because Jesus is from Jesus lived, died, rose from the dead. It's all in the early 30s of the first century. And Muhammad is supposed to have died, according to Islamic tradition, in the year 632. So that's 600 years apart, but essentially parallel, the early 30s. And by the 90s of the first century, you have the New Testament written, you have churches all over the Middle East and in Southern Europe. You have people talking about Christianity in various contexts. Whereas in the same period, from the 630s to the 690s, the 60 years after Muhammad's career, or supposedly Muhammad's career, you have nothing. You have a couple of bare mentions of the name Muhammad. Every time that they are filled in with any details, they don't match what Islamic tradition tells us about Muhammad. You have the Arabs conquering all of the Middle East, North Africa, Iran, an incredible conquest, which is supposed to have been inspired by Muhammad's words, and yet nobody ever mentions them or refers to them as Muslims or says they have a new prophet or a new religion or a new holy book, and they themselves don't behave that way either. One notable example, of course, is the inscriptions on coins and on public buildings that were constructed by the early Arab empires. They often have crosses on them. Now, if you think about it, Muhammad is supposed to have said that Jesus is going to come back and break the cross because the cross is an insult. The Quran in chapter 4, verse 157 says that Jesus was not crucified. They did not kill nor crucify him, but it appeared so to them. They thought they did, but they didn't. And Islamic tradition holds that it was Judas who was crucified. He looks like Jesus, but he wasn't Jesus. It would be an insult to Allah's transcendent majesty that one of his prophets would be victimized and killed. Now, imagine if you were hearing that from Muhammad in the 630s, before he dies in 632. And so you go out thinking the cross is an abomination and an insult to Allah. And in 660, you build a public building and you put a cross on it.
Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense.
No.
There's just no way. And you make mint coins, and the coins have crosses on them. No way. This is an abomination. Any Muslim will tell you to this day, any contemporary Muslim will tell you that the cross is an insult to Allah. That's what they think of it.
Right.
So it's much more likely that the stories about Muhammad telling people that Jesus is going to come back and break the cross, and even the Quran passage, dates from later than the public buildings with their and the coins with their inscriptions. And that's just one little bit of evidence. There's mountains of evidence. It's all in the book.
Right. And so when you talk about buildings with crosses, are you referring to primarily, are you referring to Byzantium type architectural churches? Is that what you're referring to?
No, I'm referring to Arabic public buildings.
Okay.
And, you know, like if you go into a public building today, there'll be a plaque and it'll say so-and-so was the governor and so-and-so was the mayor. And everybody's taking credit for building this public building. And this is a venerable tradition. Politicians always want credit.
Yeah.
And so you go back to the 650s, 660s, there are buildings that were constructed by the new Arab conquerors of various areas in the Middle East and North Africa. And they bear the name of notably Muawiyah, who was caliph from 661 to 680. And Muawiyah has crosses on the building.
Wow.
Why would he do that if he's within the lifetime of so many people who knew Muhammad? And he's got every reason to think the Quran is supposed to have been collected and distributed to all the Muslim provinces in the year 653. Didn't Muawiyah, the caliph of all the Muslims, get one? And didn't he read about Jesus not dying on the cross? It doesn't make any sense. And
no.
That's just one aspect. There's so many.
Yeah. And of course, the thing about coins is, and any archaeological items, coins in particular don't lie. They tell you what was going on at a given time. They tell you who the ruler was and so forth. So in terms of this movement that we call Islam today, Robert, what do you think it looked like in its early stages? If Muhammad did not actually exist, do you believe that he was a conjectural figure, a figure that they had to create out of necessity? Why do you think the figure of Muhammad comes into the picture?
Yeah, I think actually Muhammad was invented because of the Arab Empire. That in those days there were not parliaments, there were not constitutions. Empires were held together by a common religion. This is why the Byzantine Empire was so intent on formulating Christian doctrine down to the last detail with incredible precision, and why there were ecumenical councils, meetings of all the bishops, because this was a matter of citizenship. This was a matter of determining who was going to be a full citizen of the empire and who was not.
Right.
The Christian faith defined the citizenship in the Christian Roman or Byzantine Empire. And so it's the same thing with the Persians, and they were Zoroastrian. And Zoroastrianism is what held their empire together. The Arabs amassed the empire without having the religion. They had there was a very common monotheism in this area, and it was connected to Abraham. And you see traces of it in Islam, in the Quran, and so on. But it was very creedally vague. And its relationship to Judaism and Christianity was asserted rather than actual. And Islam was built upon it. But it wasn't enough of itself to sustain this empire and unify it, at least in the view of its rulers. So around the time of Abdul Malik, the caliph from 685 to 705, and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who was the governor of Iraq around the same time, we start seeing the mentions of Muhammad that are much more specific. Muhammad is the prophet of Allah, and the particular elaboration that led to the elaboration of traditions about Muhammad that led to the 9th century hadith, with the explosion of material about Muhammad that gives us details about practically every day of his life. If that material existed in the 7th century, then we would have every reason to believe that somebody might have referred to it at some point. That the conquered people, trying to understand what had happened, we know that they asked and discussed why you've invaded with the invaders. Sophronius of Jerusalem, the Patriarch of Jerusalem in the 630s, wrote extensively about the Arab conquerors and discussed things with them. And he gets no hint that they have a religion, no hint that they have a new prophet. It's only at the time of Abdul Malik and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf that Islam starts to become specifically Islamic. That is, that the Arab religion starts to become specifically Islamic. And there's some tantalizing little stories that illustrate this. Like, one is, and these are in Islamic tradition, you understand. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf is the governor of Iraq, as I noted, in the in the 690s, early 700s. And there's this tradition of an old man saying, we never read the Quran in mosques until the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Yeah. Well, why not? If you had it from the 650s, why didn't you read it? Unless maybe you didn't have it from the 650s, you had it from the 690s or the 700s. And so that's when you started reading it. And there's another tradition that's related to that of Abdul Malik saying, I believe I'm going to die during Ramadan because I was born during Ramadan, I became caliph during Ramadan, and I collected the Quran during Ramadan. Well, if Uthman collected the Quran in the 650s, why is Abdul Malik saying he did it later? It doesn't make any sense from the standpoint of the Uthmanic story. If that's authentic, then Abdul Malik would have absolutely no reason to say that. But if Abdul Malik collected the Quran and then he retrojected it into the time of Uthman and said, this is 50 years old, this is ancient material here, you haven't gotten it yet? And you know, what are they going to do? Go and Google it? They can't find out that this is not really authentic. And so that makes much more sense of the available information.
Right. And speaking about Abdul Malik, Robert, I mean, the Dome of the Rock, that edifice there on the Temple Mount is credited to him. And it's been noted, and again, just to make sure our viewers understand this, Robert's not the first person to come out and say, did Muhammad exist? And there's good evidence that he didn't. There are other scholars in the field, scholars who are specialized in Islamics, who have questioned this. And I know there was also a famous convert to Islam. His name escapes me now, Robert. That German fellow,
Muhammad Sven Kalisch.
Yes, who simply applied the same criteria that scholars use with the historical Jesus, and he applied it to Muhammad and to the texts of Islam, and he came to the conclusion that Muhammad most likely did not exist, and in fact, he was accused of being a murtad, of being an apostate, and he even received death threats for that. So so I just want people to realize this isn't Robert Spencer going out on a limb and trying to be nasty to Muslims and calling into question. I know you've been accused of being everything from an underground Zionist to you're really a Jew who's working for Mossad, and the incredible, incredible conspiracy theories you hear about you. I mean, the tales of your death have been greatly exaggerated, Robert.
Well, yeah, it's crazy because you have Bart Ehrman writing. Is this book "Did Jesus
Yes,
Exist"? Is
that's
that the
right.
name of it?
That's
And
correct.
I don't know that anybody do people accuse him of writing out of hatred of Christianity?
Exactly.
I suppose there might be some, but it's much more accepted to have historical investigation of Christianity. When it comes to Islam, suddenly it becomes some sort of hateful act.
Yes.
And I think this is ridiculous on its face. This is a historical question. It
Yeah.
has to do with readily demonstrable facts and with historical evidence that anybody can examine. Why is it somehow wrong to examine it? It's part
Right.
of the whole Islamophobia subterfuge that has
Yes.
taken over Western academia.
Yes, exactly right. And here in Canada, as in the United States, we're always being told don't to criticize anything Islamic, to criticize the Quran is to be Islamophobic, and they equate that with hatred. Of course, I mean, both you and I, Robert, we're against hatred against Muslims as human beings, but to express hatred towards an ideology. Ideologies don't have feelings. I mean, communism and Nazism don't have feelings. Islam doesn't have feelings. Christianity as an ideology doesn't have feelings, and so they always equate the questioning of the ideology with the question of hating people as an identifiable group, or even racism. And this one always gets me, Robert. That what race is Islam? Islam
Yes.
is not a race. I mean, there's white, black, brown, yellow, all types of people are welcome to embrace Islam. But just getting back to Abdul Malik, I'm sorry, I've been going off on a tangent. With Abdul Malik, the Dome of the Rock has Byzantine features. I mean, the architecture is clearly Byzantine. The dome. Can you comment on that? And the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, I think it also does not have a Qibla.
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't. And it also has a rock, the Dome of the Rock.
That's
It's got a big rock inside. I've never been inside, but
no,
that's what they say.
yeah,
And that seems to be an indication that it was designed to replace the Qibla, the Kaaba in Mecca. People don't realize Byzantine churches, Orthodox churches to this day are built in a very particular fashion. They are built designed to teach the Christian faith
right.
in a way that is clear in the architecture as much as it is in what is taught verbally. And so you go into an Orthodox church and it's got a dome over the top, because this is supposed to be the heavens and the earth and the meeting place of heaven and earth, and the place where God encounters the assembled people. In any case, there's a great deal more to that, but it's obvious that the Dome of the Rock is based on that Byzantine style architecture, which Islam doesn't hold to. It's got domes just because it does, because they copied the churches that were in the region where it was born, which is not Arabia, but a little bit farther north,
Mm-hmm.
where there were plenty of Byzantine churches. Now, the Dome of the Rock in particular, many people have speculated, is actually originally a Christian structure itself.
Yeah.
And so the architecture is not a borrowing or an homage, it's an actual use of that architecture for its intended purpose. That is, the thing was built as a church. One reason why this has been posited, as you noted, is that there's no Qibla, and that the inscriptions are all about Jesus.
Yes.
The inscriptions on the interior wall of the Dome of the Rock, one of them says there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger, and then goes on and on and on about Jesus. You got to wonder why they have this one line about Muhammad and then they go on and on and on about Jesus. And that may be another indication, along with those coins we were discussing before,
Mm-hmm.
that say Muhammad and have the cross, that Muhammad may not have been a proper name at all, but originally a title,
Mm-hmm.
the praised one. and that it was given to Jesus and to others in the course of things. And so the Dome of the Rock inscription doesn't mention Muhammad and suddenly change the subject and talk about Jesus. It's all about Jesus. And the Dome of the Rock itself was a Christian sect that is akin to the Arians or the Ebionites that denied the divinity of Christ. And so they are saying that Jesus is just a messenger and denying that he's the Son of God. It is very possible that this was one of the ingredients from which Islam was formed, and that the Kaaba also was a place of pilgrimage where people would kiss the black stone, and that's why they have the rock inside the Dome of the Rock. It's not inconsistent with it being a Christian structure, because if God threw the meteorite to Earth, he could just as well be the Christian God as well as the Islamic one. We don't have that kind of thing, that kind of idea in modern day Christianity, but you're talking about a very different time with a very different cosmology and very different view of the relation of the spiritual realm and earth, and of course heaven being the idea being that God is above the clouds in heaven and looking down at us, and he throws this rock. And anyway, it seems likely that the Dome of the Rock also was, whatever its Christian character may have been, also in competition with the structure in Mecca. And that may have to do with the war between Abdul Malik and Abdullah ibn az-Zubair, who was a rival claimant to be the caliph and was in Mecca. And so some people posit that because the earliest mosques, and this is in the new revised edition of the book, it's not in the first edition, but the Dan Gibson's tremendous discoveries about the earliest mosques being facing Petra in southern Jordan rather than Mecca.
Yes.
And then some of them in between, and then later ones facing Mecca. The Dome of the Rock may have been in the first place built as a rival to the structure in Mecca, and then the new religion was, as it was constructed, and Abdullah ibn az-Zubair was defeated, his followers were appealed to on the basis of shifting the whole thing to Arabia and making Mecca the holy place.
Right.
So that they would feel as if this was still their thing, you know, it was still what they were used to, that they had the holy place in Mecca, they had the Arabic-centric religion. And that would explain why the mosques changed the direction and why the Dome of the Rock has no Qibla of its own, because the whole thing was in flux at the time that it was built. But that's 691. If we take the standard story of the origins of Islam, then there's no explanation whatsoever for why the Dome of the Rock would not face Mecca and have a Qibla facing Mecca.
Yes, of course. And being 60 years after Muhammad died, definitely it would have been facing Mecca. The other problem too is, I mean, you're right, Robert, that Muhammad appears as being used adjectively as referring to Jesus as being the praised one. And also the inscription on the Dome of the Rock, there are major textual variants with those inscriptions with what we find today in the Uthmanic recension, but that's a text critical question.
But that's another important question, though. That's another thing that's discussed in the book, that if you have the Quran and you're going to take some passages from it and write them on the wall, why would you change them? Why would you change the word of Allah? Why would you alter it even one word when you know it's the perfect word of Allah that's existed forever with Allah in paradise and delivered in perfect form through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad? Why would you change? Why would you dare to change that? But if you write it on the wall first, and then you say, hey, this material here, this is a good basis for some scriptural passages, and you take them and you think, okay, this was well put, but we can edit it a bit and make it even better in the Quran. That explains it more easily, that you would take something that is not considered scripture and make it scripture and edit it in the process, rather than you would edit something you believe to be the divine word.
Right. Right. So when we look at what is believed to be the earliest biography of Muhammad, most will say Ibn Ishaq, the Sirah al-Rasul. But we don't have really his biography. What we have is Ibn Hisham's edited version of that biography. And Ibn Ishaq alone that's 150 years after allegedly Muhammad's death. And then, of course, a century or more later, I think, if I'm not mistaken, with Ibn Hisham.
Yeah, Ibn Hisham is about 200 years after Muhammad.
200 years after.
And so really, we don't have a biography of Muhammad till 200 years after he lived.
Yeah.
So this is 2021. In 1821, let's see, Thomas Jefferson died in 1826. Imagine if we are only now hearing about Thomas Jefferson and only now getting a biography of him. There would be absolutely no way to control for legendary editions.
No. And so that is one of the problematic issues with Muhammad is the biography is so late. The Gospels are decades after Jesus's death, resurrection. But in the case of Muhammad, we're talking about centuries. Now, with the Hadith, it's another 200 plus years, like Bukhari and Al-Muslim and Sunan Abu Dawud, I think, is later. But in the case of the Hadith, Robert, the fact that Bukhari had to trim down all of these collections, I think he took it down to 1 point. It was less than 2%. I mean, he really thinned it down.
It was just a little over 1%. He collected 600,000 traditions, 600,000 hadiths, 600,000 stories of Muhammad's words and deeds. And he published 7,000, including many repetitions. So actually, if you take the repetitions, like, Muslim apologists in the West nowadays like to deny that Aisha was 9, but Islamic tradition is very clear, and Bukhari has Aisha being 9, tells that story, 3, 4, 5 times. And so you take out all the repetitions, and you've got, I'm sure, 6,000 or less independent traditions. That's 1% of everything that he collected. And so I think it's absolutely true. He was right. There were massive amounts of forgeries with different parties in the Islamic world vying for the dominance of their point of view by inventing stories of Muhammad and putting in his mouth the positions that they wanted to espouse. And then the other side would do the same thing. So the Hadith are full of contradictions. And Bukhari was right. Most of them were forgeries. He was only 7,000 off. The other 7,000 were forgeries too.
Right. And how reliable, Robert, is the whole concept of isnad, the chain of transmission? I mean, to say that so-and-so Ibn Abbas got it from Anas, and he got it from this guy, and he got it from this guy. I mean, how are we to track the reliability of the chain of transmission? I mean, it's just,
there's no way. It's ridiculous. It's really an incredible thing that this whole religion is based on this, and there are people who stoutly defend the historicity of Muhammad when you have like I'll tell you, in the new book, the new edition, Did Muhammad Exist? Revised and Expanded, I've got a discussion of some of the contemporary historians. Gregor Scholler is one who writes about Urwa ibn Zubair, isn't it? I think it is, the earliest biographer of Muhammad. And he says, this guy, he got stories of Muhammad straight from his Aunt Aisha. And it sounds great, It sounds like, wow, he was right there, straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. And yet, he doesn't tell us, Scholler doesn't tell us, that Urwa, we don't have any of his writings. We only have people quoting him again in the 9th century. And so we don't know what he got from his Aunt Aisha and how much it was changed in the meantime. The whole idea of the isnads is ridiculous, that so-and-so, or Aisha tells Urwa, tells so-and-so, tells so-and-so, tells so-and-so. So first, if you're a pious Muslim and you believe these are reliable stories, you have to believe that every last one of these people had total recall and absolutely perfect memories. And that there was never any slippage in anything that they remembered, and they didn't write it down, or if they wrote it down, it was lost. So that's one thing. The other thing is that Bukhari judged the reliability of traditions based on the reliability of the people in the chains of transmission. So if there was one guy who people thought, well, he exaggerated a little bit, he might have even told a white lie or two, and then he was out, then the tradition is out. Or if there's a chain missing, like Aisha told Joe who told somebody else we don't know who told Fred, then that doesn't work. You can't have a broken chain.
Right.
But even if you have a chain that's got everybody is a fine, upstanding individual, you don't know that they remember everything perfectly.
Right.
And you don't know also these fine, upstanding individuals may have had all kinds of motives to change the story to suit them. I know that it might seem inconceivable. A Muslim might think, well, this is an offensive thing to say, but this is human nature. This is how people tell stories. Think about how you tell stories.
Yeah.
How everybody tells stories. People like to exaggerate for dramatic effect, and any number of things could distort the story. Also, and the bottom line about the isnads, if you can make up a story, you can make up an isnad chain. And the earliest hadiths don't have isnad chains.
Mm-hmm.
So they're made up as much as the stories are. They started getting tacked on. People started saying, well, how do we know these stories are true? And so somebody said, well, I got this from Aisha, who told it to so-and-so, who told it to so-and-so. Oh, well, that's very impressive. Then it must be an authentic story. Mm-hmm. So then the next guy, what's to prevent him from saying, oh, my story's authentic? I got it from Abu Huraira, who told Urwa, and then it goes on and on. Yeah. If I can make it up, why couldn't they have?
Right.
Well, they wouldn't have. They were pious and upright, upstanding Muslims. And yet we know that 593,000 traditions were forged according to the pious Bukhari.
Yeah. And
so
that's a huge chunk when you really think about it.
That's an awful lot. Yeah.
That's a lot of information that he edited out. And even Ibn Hisham, he also admitted that he had to leave some parts out of Ibn Ishaq's
yeah, they were too shocking.
They were too shocking.
As if what's in there isn't shocking enough.
Yeah. And so here you have a biographer. A biographer of Muhammad. Well, I guess a secondhand biographer, as they would say, who is facing some trepidation about passing on some of the things that he read, and he says, they're basically too embarrassing and so forth. So here we have 200 years plus after the death allegedly of Muhammad in 632, and there's nothing before that. And
there's nothing.
And this is why I try to tell our Muslim friends that, as you know from our conversations in the past, Robert, I usually engage with Muslim apologists in debate and so forth, and many of the Muslim audience that I would engage just didn't seem to find any inconsistency in throwing the Gospels out, which were written decades after Jesus, but having no problem accepting Bukhari and Muslim, which came 2 centuries after Muhammad. And they simply couldn't make the connection that they were willing to trust these documents that are 2 centuries. And like you put into perspective, Jefferson's death in 1826, and then bring this up to 2026. That is a lot. That's a long time. I mean, my country of Canada, we're not even that old. I think we're still younger than 200 years. But
yeah, there was Rupert's Land or something up there.
When
Jefferson was there.
Right. And so the inconsistencies that we find, that the Gospels are dubious. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are dubious, but not Bukhari, and definitely not Sunan Abu Dawud.
There's another thing too, Tony. I was just thinking, Bukhari's criterion is just unworkable every which way. And another way that it's unworkable is that, what if you have an authentic story? I mean, like, say, what if you knew Muhammad? Okay. So you come to me and you tell me this great story about Muhammad.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell it to my friend who tells it to his friend. And then it gets six steps down the road, but they can't remember all the names of the people who transmitted it.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean it's not ipso facto inauthentic. And it's supposed to be an abundance of caution, but that brings us back to the other problem, that you have plenty of inauthentic stories that can have impeccable chains of narration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. And also the fact that, I think you mentioned this in your book as well, that the name Muhammad appears 4 times in the Arabic text of the Quran, whereas Jesus and Jesus, I think Moses is the most referred prophet. And there's Abraham, and Jesus, I think, is 25 times. Very strange, isn't it, Robert?
Yeah, it's very strange. People don't realize that. They assume that Muhammad's all over the Quran. A lot of people assume that when they hear stories about Muhammad, that they're in the Quran, when actually, of course, they're in the Hadith that are 9th century.
Yes.
I've actually just finished a book that'll be out in November called The Critical Quran.
Yeah.
It is. I'm very excited about it. It's the first Quran to have variant readings listed, and it's the first Quran to be honest about the translation and many, many things about it. But the thing that I wanted to mention here is that the Quran only mentions Muhammad 4 times, as you noted. And every one of those mentions, there's nothing biographical about him in there.
No.
And meanwhile, there are abundant mentions of the messenger.
Yeah.
And the prophet without a name. And everyone assumes that that's Muhammad. But on what basis is that assumption made? That assumption is made on the basis of those 9th century hadith.
Right.
There is absolutely no reason within the text of the Quran itself to assume that it's all about Muhammad and that the messenger is Muhammad. The messenger could be any number of other people.
Amazing.
And maybe even more than one.
Yes. Yes. And those messengers, of course, are said to be slain. Some of them were killed. And yet you've got this weird passage in Surah 4:157 where Jesus gets away with it. Like he doesn't get it. Like he's whisked away by Allah. He's like,
well, yeah,
beam me up sessions in Star Trek. He's just taken out, and someone else dies. But in other places throughout the Quran, it's very clear that many of the messengers of Allah were slain by the Jews, particularly the Jews. They're the ones.
It's very strange, because it's the big thing on the rap sheet for the Jews that they killed the prophets, and yet later, like we were discussing at the beginning of the show, it's supposed to be an insult to Allah to say that his prophets could suffer loss.
Yes,
he's always supposed to protect them. So why didn't he protect these other prophets from the Jews?
That's
it
right.
is complete inconsistency, absolutely intellectual confusion.
And they always say we make no difference among the prophets, but they do, because Jesus is special, and Jesus gets away with being killed through crucifixion. So in terms of this early movement, I think Michael Cook and others have referred to these as the Hagarites or the Saracens. Can you shed some light on that? What exactly the Saracens are? Is this just a name for this Arabic movement?
Well, see, this is another thing that people don't realize. We talk about the Muslim conquest of the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th century, but the conquered people never refer to the conquerors as Muslims. The conquerors don't ever refer to themselves as Muslims. There is no inscription, there's no coin, there's nothing from the 7th century that says the Muslims came and invaded and took this land.
Right.
Nothing on either side. They were called by the conquered people, who were generally on a higher level of civilization. And so they left more written records about the conquests. And they call them Saracens or Hagarians, Tayyeye, even Muhajirun, but not Muslims.
Interesting.
And so this is yet another indication that the Islam just didn't exist. And this is why they didn't ever mention it. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense at all. Because, you know, if people came and knocked on my door and took over my house, I would ask them who they were. And they would tell me. And I would say, the feds came, or whoever, and took my house. I wouldn't make up some other name for them that they weren't using. The idea that nobody ever refers to them as Muslims is ridiculous. You could say, well, they're writing polemically, they're writing negative names. These names, Tayyeye, Saracens, Hagarian, these are not pejorative names.
Right.
They're descriptive names in various ways. Like Hagar is the wife, the mistress of Abraham.
Yeah.
And these are the Arabs that are supposed to be the children of Hagar, of Ishmael. So nobody was thinking that was pejorative. That's what the Arabs say they are. So Hagarians is a perfectly reasonable thing to call them. Maybe that's even what they called themselves. Right.
Do you know the Fred Donner postulates that this early movement was probably the true believers, that they were simply Jews or Christians who had, as you said earlier, apostatized. They went heretical. Some scholars have argued that this early movement was an anti-Nicene movement, a movement that had rejected the councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon, the idea of the Son of God being homoousios, of the same substance with the Father. And then, of course, Chalcedon referring to Jesus as the God-man, and of course the Theotokos, his mother, being the God-bearer, because the Quran says a lot about this idea of God. How can God have a son when he has no wife, and so forth? So do you think that theory is plausible, that this was probably a sectarian group that, as you said, rejected the divinity of Jesus and was more of a Neo-Aryan group?
Yeah, it seems like the Dome of the Rock inscription is an anti-Chalcedon Christian inscription. So it's denying the sonship, the divinity, and so on. Of course, Arians didn't go as far. They said Jesus is the Son of God and so on. But it is not hard to imagine that once you've embarked on that pathway, that you would end up de-emphasizing the role of Jesus to a greater degree in the interests of preserving monotheism as you see it. And so you would say that it's an insult to Allah's transcendent majesty that he should have a son, because he's complete, as the Quran says. He doesn't need help. And to say that he's got a son implies that he needs help, because, well, a farmer has a son to help him out in the fields. So he doesn't need this. And so I think that it's very likely that in the welter of early Christianity, when you have these Christological debates being going on for centuries, that there would be some who would follow out the idea of unity rather than Trinity to what they believed to be its logical conclusion, which would be denial of the sonship. And that would lead you right to what Islam says.
Yes, and even in the aftermath of Nicaea in 325 AD, of course, we know that Arianism for a while did hold the upper hand.
Yes.
I'm sure you heard of Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, being exiled a number of times and even being presumed dead while he's sitting in a council, being told that he's died. But Arianism did, and we know that some of Constantine's descendants did impose Arianism in the empire. So it doesn't take a big leap to conceive of it floating down into the Arabian Peninsula as well. And I think there's some elements of Nestorianism in there as well. I think the
denial of
the hypostatic union.
Exactly. The denial that Jesus is the Son of God could go back to that.
Yeah.
Even though Nestorius doesn't go that far. There again, you follow out the logic and you end up there.
Yeah. And it's also interesting that Khadija's cousin apparently was a Nestorian priest. I think it was Waraka.
Yes, Waraka bin Nawfal.
Yeah. So, Robert, what do we do with, and I'm sure you probably get these questions all the time, and I think you do address it in your book, in your new book as well, the whole criterion of embarrassment. So somebody would say, hey, Robert, how can you believe any of this stuff? I mean, how can Muhammad not be real? So take, for example, the Satanic Verses, this embarrassing story of Muhammad acquiescing to the Meccans and praying with them, and then invoking the three daughters of Allah, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. And so some of them might say, well, why would any Muslim in their right mind create such an embarrassing story of their prophet uttering the words that Satan threw into his mouth? How would you respond to a question dealing with the criterion of embarrassment?
Well, imagine if you were, well, in the first place, the general answer about the criterion of embarrassment is what's embarrassing to us is not necessarily embarrassing to them.
Right.
And that everything has a purpose. And so what if you are constructing a religion out of various existing parts, and you're doing it of necessity on a rather ad hoc basis, so that you end up in the course of time and under the force of circumstances, you have to revise certain aspects. How do you explain that when you have a divine religion that is being dictated by Allah? You have to have the story about how the prophet had to change what he said. And so you construct a story on that basis.
Right.
And because Allah, in the Surah 22 in the Quran, promises that Satan always tries to interfere with the messages of a prophet, but Allah will always throw out what he puts in. So you've got an excuse for revising, and you've got what seems to be a reasonably airtight explanation for it all, that Satan tries to interfere with the prophets, but Allah always protects the message. So you can trust what's being said because Allah has thrown out the satanic parts. Meanwhile, we've made these revisions because Satan did interfere and we had to fix it.
Right, right. And the Quran is very quick to say, but it happened with all the other prophets too. So
yes, not just
Moses fumbled, and Jesus fumbled, and Noah fumbled. Even though we have no record of that in terms of Satan putting words in Jesus' mouth, we know he tempted Jesus, but nothing about him putting Jesus getting confused with Satan's revelation as opposed to God.
Yes.
So what you would say then, Robert, is that the figure of Muhammad that is spoken of today by millions of Muslims around the world, that figure, you would say, was constructed in the period of the Hadith, the formation of the Hadith, 200 years after the alleged death of Muhammad. Is that where you would pin that?
And that the embarrassing aspects, like the 9-year-old, the marriage with the 9-year-old, well, these guys had marriages with children, and so they gave him one. It was a classic example of creating God in your own image that that people have done throughout history in all sorts of different contexts. And so they were warriors. They wanted to preserve their empire by means of, and expand it by means of renewed warfare. So they sanctified warfare and violence. And they wanted to have children as wives, so they gave their prophet a child. They wanted to marry relatives. They gave him his wife, his daughter-in-law, for a wife. All these things.
Right.
It sounds terrible to us, but to them it was just a matter of taking their own practices and giving them the air of sanctity.
So the prophet becomes essentially an archetype for all of these practices and child marriage and jihad and fighting and so forth. It's so sad, Robert, when you think about the fact that the whole sunnah, the whole concept of the sunnah, is based on the pattern of the prophet, the conduct of the prophet. And so many Muslims today will dress like they believe the prophet dressed. They will act like the prophet, including killing those who mock Islam, mock him, and so forth and so on. And it's just incredible when you think of the fact that this may be someone who never existed in world history, and yet millions of people today are following his example and his model.
Well, yeah, it is rather absurd, but on the other hand, the world's full of absurdities.
Yeah.
Obviously they believe that he is a historical figure, and most people have not had access to this information. In the Islamic schools, look, not just in the Islamic schools, but when I was studying Islam in college in the 1980s, we were told that Muhammad lived in the full light of history, and that what he said was what he said and did was a matter of historical record, that he was well attested. These things were taught. This was at the University of North Carolina, and the University of North Carolina was not in the least any different from any other school. And so if professors are telling you this, then how is the average believing Muslim to know that this is all fabrication?
Right.
These things are only just coming out now, really. Muhammad Sven Kalish was some years ago when he discovered that Muhammad probably did not exist, and he's still rather singular, but I think there is a growing realization of the very shaky historical foundations that Islam is on, and Muslims are beginning to investigate it, beginning to try to formulate answers to it. I was just seeing on Twitter today some clown saying that he's going to come up with this devastating refutation of my book, and I thought, well, I'll be interested to see that. But I've heard that song before, Tony.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, I know. I know. Yeah, it's
never ends up working out.
Yeah, the music always remains the same in that respect.
Yes.
But I just want to remind all our viewers, those of you who may have joined us, we are with Robert Spencer tonight. And in the description box, what I've done is I've provided you with links to Robert's jihadwatch.org, his website. I would highly recommend subscribing to it. You'll get daily feeds into your inbox, which will keep you up to date on what's going on around in the Islamic world in terms of jihad activity, terrorist activity, and their involvement with, or attempted involvement with government, Western governments, to undermine them. And also there's a link to Robert's new book that we are discussing tonight, is Did Muhammad Exist? A revised expanded edition. And that's available now. Am I correct, Robert? That is now.
Yes, it is.
So
you can get it on Amazon, I hope, for
there it is.
For a good while. Barnes and Noble, any self-respecting bookstore.
Yeah.
This is the one, though. Don't get the old one. This is the one.
Get the new one. The other one's been abrogated.
That's right.
So this is the Medinan version, hot off the press from.
Whenever we abrogate or cause to be forgotten a Spencer book, we give you one just as good or better.
Just as good and even better. So this is the new and improved, right out of the heavenly plates, preserved in the tablet in heaven. So the links are there in the description box. So please check them out. Robert, as I said, Robert, I'm speaking to you and I'm looking over, and I've got a number of your books in my library here. I really enjoyed your book on the Palestinian conflict and the whole history, the creation of the Palestinian state and so forth, and the constant warfare against the Jewish people. And so really, really interesting book. Look forward to Robert's book in November on the critical Quran.
That one's available now for pre-order.
Oh, it's on pre-order. So what I usually do, Robert, is I usually show people, like, here's a copy of the Greek New Testament, and you'll notice that in the Greek New Testament you've got something called the apparatus down here, and what it does is it points out variant readings and so forth. And we also have it in the Hebrew Bible as well. So Christians and Jews have never shied away from the fact that we acknowledge textual variants in our scriptures. That has been known since time immemorial. But as you know, Robert, there is no official Quran today published by Saudi Arabia or any Islamic university in Cairo, Al-Azhar, that has a critical apparatus. But this is
the very first
commentary,
one.
I think, is the first one.
Yes.
Yeah.
This critical Quran is going to be the very first ever Quran to have variant readings marked.
Right.
Put in as many as I could possibly find. Of course, there are many more.
Right. So, Robert, I'm just going to scan through and see if we have any questions for you. Okay to take some questions tonight?
Sure.
Okay, so let me just scan through here our chat here. So if you do have any questions for our guest, Robert Spencer, you can put it in the chat. So let me see if there's anything here for you, Robert.
All right.
Okay, and I'll put it on the screen so you could read it. Let me see. All right. I'm always looking for that question mark. And let's just take a look here. Most of what I see here seems to be comments. Okay, here's one. This one is from Live, Laugh, Love, Truth. Okay. There are too many Muhammads in history, too many messengers, too many holy people, so-called. But how many Gothams in Islamic history? I don't know if that's meant to be.
I don't know what that is. What's Gotham?
Okay. Maybe it's a joke, or maybe it's.
Isn't that where Batman lives, in Gotham City?
Maybe that's the Arabicized form of Gotham. But
are you talking about maybe Kutam, the original name of Muhammad? Katam? That might be what you have in mind. That's there's a very strange tradition that's discussed in the book where it says that Muhammad's original name was Katam or Kutam.
Okay.
Qatam or Qutham.
Okay.
And that's just another indication that this all is so very fluid,
right,
and not historical, because there is no trace in the Islamic traditions of I mean, in the standard canonical story of Islam, of Muhammad having another name.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
why does he have this name in some traditions? Maybe it's because there were traditions of some fellow named Kutam whose stories were incorporated into the Muhammad legend. That
Right.
would make sense.
Right.
It would not make sense if you have a guy named Muhammad to make up a story that, oh, he was called some other name for a while. And that's what we would have to believe if we accept the standard story.
Yeah. And in Surah 61, verse 6, where Jesus allegedly is predicting the coming of Ahmed, which is interesting because in Ubay bin Ka'b's rendition, in his version, he doesn't mention anyone by name. He actually talks about a community. I don't know if if you're familiar with that variant, Robert, but in Ubay bin Ka'b's rendition of Surah 61:6, the name Ahmad is missing completely. Yeah, and refers
Well,
to
that's
the
interesting.
community. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so let me just keep on going here, see if there's any other questions. Okay, there's a question here, Robert. It's addressed to me, but I'm going to give it to our guest since he's written on this. So, Robert, why the various names, various Arabic tribes? I guess that means why they called Saracens, Hagarites, and
yeah, different tribes, and also the people who are talking have their own pet names as well. Like I mean, this was not the first time in most cases that they had encountered these people, and so they were used to calling them the Saracens or whatever,
right,
in whatever case may be.
right. Okay, all right. So let's just keep on going here. There's another question here. Didn't Jews use the name Hagarim for non-Jews?
I don't know.
I
Maybe
don't.
so. I don't know.
I think they would call them goyim. I mean, goyim is the standard Hebrew word for Gentiles.
Yeah, that's the
Nation,
nations, right? Yeah.
nation, the goyim.
I don't know that they were all the children of Hagar, but the Arabs are.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that
by their own account.
Yeah, and I think the Jews understood that as well. Okay, good question. So let's take a few more here.
I see a guy said Quran is many Gnostic books combined. That's also important to note.
Okay.
Since we were talking about early Christianity, I should just point out that it says they did not kill him or crucify him, but it appeared so to them.
Yes.
Quran 4:157. It's the Gnostic Christians who said that matter was evil, and so Jesus was not crucified, but it only seemed so.
Right.
And it seems very clear that the Quran takes over that Gnostic view.
Yeah.
And so it's likely that there were Gnostics in the area of Iraq and Syria where Islam originated.
Yes.
Since especially because they were heretics as far as the Byzantine Empire was concerned.
Right.
So they were living on its outskirts, either outside the empire altogether or at a place where the imperial hand was very weak.
Yeah, and I think as well that phrase, Robert, in Arabic about it seems so to them, actually does appear in a Gnostic text where it's dealing with Jesus's crucifixion.
The second treatise of the Great Seth.
That's it. That's right. And there it says it so appeared to them. And so that language is clearly Gnostic, that they couldn't kill Jesus because, well, he wasn't a human to start with. He was one of those divine eons in Gnosticism that come down from the pleroma, from the fullness, from God up in heaven and so forth. So, and of course, that runs in a head collision, as you know, Robert, with Surah 19, where you've got John the Baptist and Jesus in parallel, and there they both say, "Peace be on me on the day I was born and the day I die, and the day I shall be raised." And then Surah 355, "I will cause you to die and take you to myself." And so, and it's funny, Robert, just while we're on it, that I think Bukhari doesn't even discuss that 4:157. And it's very strange that he doesn't even discuss it.
That may be, I don't know.
Those 40 Arabic words, he just doesn't touch it, which is very strange. Okay, let me just take another look here at what we have, if we have any other questions for our guest. All right, let me just take a look here. Well, just this is just a praise here for you. So far, I've read about 1/3 of Dr. Spencer's new book. Good luck to anyone who thinks they're going to disprove anything he has written. Yeah,
tend
Robert.
to agree.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Robert makes some airtight watertight arguments in his books. So, yeah, or as Mr. T said, I pity the fool that tries to undermine. Yeah. Okay, here's another one, Robert. Here's another one. Can you confirm that Isa's name came from the mocking of the Jews in Arabia on Jesus, and Muhammad stole it?
Well, I know that Isa is not Jesus in Arabic, but I don't know where it came from. Do you know, Tony?
Well, in the Encyclopedia of Islam, I forgot this particular scholar's name, but the suggestion that was made in the Encyclopedia of Islam is that when Muhammad was in Medina, that is, if we follow the stories of the Hadith, that he was in Medina, the Jews obviously according to the Quran, there is knowledge of the Jewish aspersions on Jesus and his mother. Surah 4:156. For example, they raised a calumny against Isa and his mother. And one of the things that the Jews did in the Talmud was they mocked Jesus by calling him Esau, the one who sold his birthright for a pot of porridge, if you remember in the book of Genesis.
Oh, Esau, yes.
Esau, the twin brother, the hairy twin brother of Jacob. And so the name Esau in Arabic sounds like the Arabic Isa in the Quran. And so what the Encyclopedia of Islam actually posited was that some of the Jews in Medina, when Muhammad would ask about who this Jesus is that the Christians worship, they said, "Oh, that's Isa. They worship Isa." And so the idea is that he may have gotten that, again, that's granting if he existed, that he had gotten that nomenclature from the Medinan Jews who used the Talmud as their backup to mock Jesus of Nazareth. And in the Talmud, I don't know if you know this, Robert, but in the Talmud, Jesus is not called Yeshua. His proper name is Yeshua in Aramaic and Hebrew. He's called Yeshu. So they dropped the final A there because Yeshua means he shall save his people, he shall save. And Yeshu is a Hebrew acronym for may his name be blotted out and forgotten. So it's a pejorative term. And so Esau is also used in the Talmud to refer to Jesus as that apostle.
Well, that may be. You don't need the standard story of Muhammad for any of that to be true, because it could have happened in the 9th century with people probably farther north.
Right. So as Robert already said, if you ask an Arab Christian, they would tell you that the name of Jesus of Nazareth in Arabic is not Isa, it's Yeshua, which is very close to the Yeshua in Aramaic and Hebrew. Another question, Robert, due to what the Quran states about attacking the unbelievers, how can there be a moderate Muslim?
Moderate Muslim is a term that's thrown around and nobody ever defines it. What does it mean? Is a moderate Muslim somebody who doesn't act upon the violent passages of the Quran and never will? Then there are plenty of them. Does a moderate Muslim mean somebody who doesn't believe in the violent passages of the Quran and doesn't think that it's right for other Muslims to act upon them? Then that's going to be a much smaller group.
Yeah.
If any. Because if you're a believing Muslim, then the jihad warfare is part of the faith. You may never take it up yourself, but you know that it's a good thing to do. And so it really depends. People talk about moderate Muslims, and I think most of the time they assume that they mean people who are aware of the violent passages in the Quran and reject them. And that's vanishingly few people, really. There might be some sincere reformers out there, one or two. They might have a few followers here and there. Most of the time you're talking about Muslims who don't know what's in the Quran because they don't care, or because they only read it, they only recite it in Arabic and they don't know Arabic. Most of the biggest Muslim populations in the world today are not of Arabs.
Right.
So they're reciting Quran in Arabic at the mosque. They might not have any idea what it means. Kids in the madrasas in Pakistan memorize the whole Quran without knowing Arabic. They're just memorizing a lot of syllables.
Right.
And so they may not know that the Quran teaches these things, or they may not care. But Muslims who know and care that the Islam teaches violence and reject it, I don't know, it might be 5 of them. I don't know, very few.
No. Yeah, I think Ibn Waraq said that Muslims may be moderate, but Islam itself is not moderate.
Exactly.
Islam is an ideology. Okay, we have another question here on John of Damascus. Did John Damascene, I'm assuming he means John of Damascus, mention him? I think he means Muhammad in the 8th century. And I think you, I'm not.
Yeah, that's discussed in the book. It's interesting. John of Damascus is one of the first ones to talk about Islam and Muhammad, but it's very clear from what he says that the Quran was not in the form that it's in today.
Right.
Because he says, for example, I've read the Quran and I've read Surah al-Baqarah.
Yeah.
He's listing off books that he's read, Islamic books that he's read. Why would you take Surah al-Baqarah as chapter 2 of the Quran, the chapter of the cow?
Yeah.
Why would you mention it? If I read a book, I don't have to mention that I read a particular chapter, unless maybe that particular chapter is not yet part of that book and was put in later.
Right. Right. Interesting. Okay. All right. So let's just go on here again. How are we on time, Rob? Are you still okay, or do you have to leave?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let me see if we have any other questions here.
Yes, a goat ate the old edition.
What's that, Robert?
A goat ate the original edition
Yes,
of
the stone
Did Muhammad Exist?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah, I think in terms of questions, I think that's pretty much it. Robert, so are there any other things you want to add about your new book? I mean, again, I have the first edition. So in this new edition, what are you adding that was not in your first edition?
Well, it's 25% new. I add in material about some of the things that I touched on earlier about the early historians of Muhammad before Ibn Ishaq, and why modern day historians are silly to say that these people are reliable witnesses to Muhammad. There's also the material about Petra that Dan Gibson discovered, that we also mentioned before, that the earliest mosques don't face Mecca, they face Petra. There is material about the Qiraat, the different forms of the Quran, and the fact that there is no single standardized text, contrary to popular belief,
right,
and that there are many variations in the manuscripts, also contrary to Islamic apologetics claims,
right,
that every last one of the manuscripts is in total agreement with every other one. We've just touched on this, that there's so many variants, and that's also discussed here. So all that is new, and also I rearranged a bit of it to make it clearer, and other than that, everything is pretty much everything that was in the first edition is in this one, plus much more.
Right. And also, folks, Robert also footnotes and or endnotes his references. So this isn't just his ideas. He does back up his arguments.
Oh yeah.
And
one other thing, Tony, I should mention is there was a guy, you can probably still find it on the first edition of Did Muhammad Exist? There was a fellow wrote a 6,000 word rebuttal, a very massive rebuttal at Amazon. And this was brought to my attention by a man who wrote to me, and he said, "You have to answer this." And I thought, oh, I as if I don't have enough to do. You're giving me another job here. But I did think, well, all right, I'm making a new version of this book. I do answer all of his points. I don't take it and answer them point by point, but in the course of this book, all the arguments that are made against the first edition are answered.
Right. Right. Excellent. So, well, this question here, was it a goat or a sheep that ate the manuscript? Well,
a tame sheep.
It was a tame sheep, according to...
I believe that's what Aisha says, if I recall correctly.
Yes, she was preoccupied with the funeral of the prophet, and a tame sheep came and ate. Okay, how about this one, Robert? Islam's connection to moon worship. Hubal, I believe, is what he meant. Hubal is Allah. Sun, moon, Arabic letters that match occult mansions of the moon. Years done by moon, not science. I'm
not sure what the question is.
Yeah,
I mean, it's clear that
is Allah the moon god? Is there a connection to the moon worship?
Well, there is that's something that people have made a whole lot of, that I don't really think. I've never been really excited about that. People saying Allah is the moon god and so on, and that the moon god is the god of war. I think, well, whether that's true or not, and I don't have any reason to doubt it. I'm just saying there's plenty in the Quran and plenty in the Hadith to give you Islam as the religion of war. You don't need to go back to some pre-Islamic thing to establish that. But there's no doubt Islam is lunar, and the calendar is lunar, and that's why the days move through the month. I mean, through the year, the holidays. Ramadan is in summer sometimes, and in winter other times. It's also noteworthy that there were leap months in Muhammad's day, or the time that he's supposed to have lived. There was an extra month that was added to the calendar, just like we have an extra day that's added to the calendar every 4 years to keep the calendar in line with the astronomical facts. So the lunar calendar was supplemented with an extra month every few years. It's actually abrogated. This is abolished in chapter 9 of the Quran. And so chapter 9 of the Quran was revealed very late, according to Islamic tradition. Islamic tradition would have it that Muhammad lived with the leap months all through his life until right at the end of his life when they were abolished. But if you go to Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham, to the biography, nothing ever happens during the leap months. And so that's another indication that this is not historical material. That by the time this stuff was written, people had forgotten there were leap months, so they forgot to put anything in there that Muhammad was doing at those times.
I usually discourage a lot of folks to abandon the so-called Allah of the moon god. I don't know if you remember back in the 90s, I think it was, there was a gentleman whom I knew personally. He's now deceased, a Christian writer.
You're breaking up a bit. I'm sorry. What was that now?
Sorry. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. There was a friend of mine back in the 90s who wrote a book. His name was Robert Morey. I'm sure you've heard of him. He's a Christian writer. He wrote a book called The Islamic Invasion. And in there, he mentioned Allah as the moon god. And I remember pleading with him not to publish that chapter because the fact of the matter is that, I mean, Allah swears by the moon in the Quran. He swears by the sun. He swears by the star. He swears by everything that is created. Although we're told by Muslims we should never swear by anything but Allah swears by created things. But the idea that he was the moon god, I don't see that connection at all.
I've never been enamored of that argument.
It was prevalent since Mesopotamia. You know, the god Sin, for example, the Mesopotamian moon god. Was the moon god worshipped in Arabia? Yes, but to say that is the head god of the Arabic pantheon, I think is a bit of a stretch. And I don't think it's fruitful, actually. I think...
yes, I totally agree. It's also worth noting that the Quran says, I forget right where, but I know it's in there, that Allah is greater than the moon and greater than the sun and so on. So it's not as if this is some cult of the moon in that sense at all.
Right. And I think that the use of the crescent moon, Robert, if my memory serves me correctly, I think it was introduced into Islam by the Turks. I may be mistaken, but I was
in any case, this means Islam's always growing. It's in perpetual. That's why they like green too. It's perpetual springtime. It's always expanding.
Right. Okay. Someone mentions that Petras not being questioned. I think what he means by that
all of this is being questioned.
Yeah.
The direction of the you should look at Gibson's book, because he calculated very carefully the direction in which the mosques face, the qiblas of the various mosques, and calculated how close they were to facing Petra versus Jerusalem versus Mecca. And the information that he provides is quite compelling. There are people, Don, what's the fellow's name? I always forget his name. David King, I think it is, who was the expert on qiblas before Gibson came along. And he wrote a very lengthy refutation of Gibson's work. But all he says is that it's Islamophobic, which I think, well, that's just ridiculous. That's not an academic criterion. And he says he knows all about qiblas. Okay, but he doesn't ever get around to giving us any solid information as to why the mosques don't face Petra, or he doesn't ever refute the fact that they do.
And when Mecca is referred to in the Quran, it is nothing like what you find in modern day Mecca. It's a place of luscious trees and rivers and so forth, and it's more germane to the region we know as Jordan today. Yeah.
Yes.
Let me see. Let me try to wrap things up here, Rob. How about this? What's the connection of the moon star with Islam? I think we answered that already.
Yes.
The idea of the expansion, the religion's expanding with light and so forth. Okay, let me see if there's anything else. I think that's pretty much it. Robert, is there anything else you want to add? I think
think
we
we've
covered
covered it well.
a lot of ground here.
Yes.
In all of this. So, and I'm sure you're getting a lot of nasty criticisms about your forthcoming book, and I'm sure it's always the same old thing that you're just an undercover Zionist and you're really a Jewish spy for the Mossad, and you're
Well,
just
of course.
I mean, it's just so obvious, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. So, folks, as I've said before, if you do want to get Robert Spencer's book, it is now available. Did Muhammad Exist? The revised and expanded edition. And so I've actually written a review for your first book, Robert, the one I got here, the first book, the first version.
No, this one. This is the one.
Yes, this is abrogated now. So my
Yes.
review is now abrogated.
Yes.
So I've been trying to find a place to I mean, I've got the review done, so now I'm going to have to do a new review. Thanks, Robert. And hopefully I'll get the other one. No publisher wanted to take the review of your book for some reason, but
Odd.
Anyway. Okay. I think that we're pretty well done here for tonight. And
Okay.
So, Robert, I just want to thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you for giving of your time, and thank you for the work that you do, and the just the investment of all that time you put into your research. And so, folks, again, I encourage you. I endorse Robert Spencer. I endorse his books, and I know that's going to be used against me, Robert. I can guarantee you that right now.
Yes.
I'll hear it on Twitter and Facebook and everywhere else. So, folks, thank you for joining us tonight. If you like this channel, please subscribe. We'll have a lot of well-known speakers like Robert Spencer on here to educate you on not just Islam but other worldviews that are in conflict with the Christian worldview. And so, once again, thanks so much, Robert. And hopefully, when you're up in Canada, we're in a very repressive communist state right now with all these lockdowns. Next time you're out here, Robert, I'd love to take you out for dinner again. And
I look forward to it.
Catch up with you. Thanks again, Robert. And thank you, everyone. And have a good night. God bless you all. Until next time. Bye-bye now.